So that's on slide 1. What is Pancasila now?
Yes, all good.
Okay. You can hear me fine as well?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yes, so the 5 principles of Pancasila, the first one is the belief in one God. The second is just and civilized humanity. Then we have unity or oneness of Indonesia, democracy guided by wisdom arising out of consultation among representatives, and social justice for all the people of Indonesia. So Pancasila is extremely pervasive throughout all aspects of Indonesian life. You'll find it from all levels of top of government up to school levels, where children will recite the Pancasila as in their weekly flag raising and national anthem ceremonies. And it's also common, you'll even hear it used as a kind of substitute for authentically Indonesian. So if somebody wants to come up with a specifically Indonesian form of democracy, for example, they'll refer to it as Pancasila democracy. The actual principles are quite vague in that they don't provide a basis for any specific political model, and they're able to be used for different goals and ideologies. It was used historically by Sukarno first for a socialist revolutionary state, and then later by Suharto for a far more pro-Western and capitalist state. It's far more frequently been used as a delegitimizing tool to shut down dissent rather than something positing an actual ideology. Yeah, so Pancasila went through a process of different formulations through a process of negotiation. And these changes are reflective of the competing ideological streams in Indonesian politics, both at the time and which remain relevant today. So the first iteration, which was announced on the 1st of June 1945, which is an important date, which I'll return to towards the end of my presentation. This is President Sukarno's initial formulation. The 5 principles are different to the ones we have today. So these are, the first one is Indonesian patriotism. The second is internationalism. The third is a deliberative consensus. Then we've got social prosperity. And the 5th is the belief in one God. So the position here in Sukarno's initial formulation is in the 5th position rather than the 1st. And this formulation, this placing this position continues to be a source of controversy between people more inclined to a secular mindset and Islamists in Indonesia. So Habib Rizik, who's a quite prominent Islamist in Indonesia, he used this to describe that Sukarno placed it at the pantat, which means at the butt of Pancasila. And he was actually accused of insulting Pancasila and of insulting Sukarno through this statement. So this, I just mentioned this just as a kind of brief background to show that this Pancasila is the site of ideological contestation amongst Islamists and the more secular nationalists. So the second iteration is what is known as the Piagam Jakarta, or the Jakarta Charter. So the 5 principles are essentially the same as what we have today, with the exception that we have what's known as the 7 words after belief in one God. Dengan kewajiban menjalankan syariat Islam bagi pemeluk-pemeluknya, which means with the obligation to implement the Islamic law for its adherents. So this was reflective of the concerns of Islamists in Indonesia, who were concerned that Sukarno's formulation was too secular, and also that he was attempting to kind of hijack the revolution and sideline the more religious Muslims' role in that. Sorry, I'll just go back one slide. And then we came to the final iteration, which removed the 7 words. This is reflective of concerns amongst probably 3 main groups, you could say: the secular nationalists, Marxists, and non-Muslims in Indonesia. So for the nationalists, they were particularly concerned with 2 things. One is that they were concerned with the possibility of non-Muslim majority areas seceding from Indonesia, so places like South Maluku, North or Central Sulawesi. Bali was perhaps not as in favour of secession, but it's another non-Muslim majority region, and they were concerned that these regions might leave and leave them with a smaller nation. Also, both nationalists and Marxists were concerned that their goal of a non-denominational state would be lost. And there was fears amongst non-Muslims that their voices would not be representative, and there was accompanying debates or calls from Islamists to have constitutional recognition of Islam as the official religion of the state, and for a requirement for the president to be a Muslim, which never were placed into law. I've actually just dealt with that on the previous part I've said. So, many of the Islamists at the time were quite hostile to Pancasila, particularly in the first and final iterations, as they saw it as being used potentially as a replacement for Islam, or a replacement for a sidelining the role of Islam in politics. So to skip 75 years, what I'm looking at is how we got from that point, where it was a controversial point of contestation, to today, where very, very few and only extremely fringe groups in Indonesia would oppose Pancasila outright. And most of them incorporate Pancasila into their ideology, even though it's no longer required as by force of law. So my research questions that I'll be looking at in my thesis is basically, how then do we account for the dominance of Pancasila and the lack of an Islamist agenda and a movement of significance promoting such an agenda in Indonesia today? And a more pertinent way to ask this would be to separate it into two separate questions. The first would be, how has a non-Islamically oriented ruling class managed to establish ideological hegemony throughout almost all levels of Indonesian society? The investigation into this will utilize Gramscian theory to analyze how this class has established its own interests and diffused its ideology throughout civil society institutions such as education systems, official religion, and the media, to the extent that this class's conception of Islam and its relationship to the state is considered as what Gramsci refers as common sense, or the understood to be the natural state of affairs. And the second and closely related question to be asked is, how have the Islamist movements established a counter-hegemony, or failed to do so, in building an alternative to the non-Islamist ruling class? Following on from this, what strategies have Islamist movements utilized to work within or from outside the Pancasila framework that so dominates Indonesian political life? So the methodology I'll be utilizing is as I briefly mentioned, a modified Gramscian analysis. So to put it very kind of oversimplified, I'll be kind of pretending that Gramsci was an Islamist, so changing the social or socioeconomic class to a religious kind of class, you could say. So I'll be utilizing the Islamist in a position where Gramsci would use it for working classes, and the more secular nationalist class as the kind of a substitute for capitalist class. So what I'll be utilizing is a combination of textual analysis from, for the first section, which is more focused on the hegemony section, I'll be focusing on particularly on the role official religion formulations play in shaping political and religious ideology in Indonesia. So particularly aspects such as how certain concepts in Islam are taught in government education or in state Islamic universities, concepts to do with jihad or khilafah, the caliphate, and to do with the exclusivity of Islam. This second section will be looking at both textual analysis and field interviews. So for the textual analysis, I'll be looking at ideological platforms of some of the actors I'll mention later in this presentation, party constitutions for political parties, as well as academic writings and polemics of the relevant actors. And I'll also be conducting research interviews with some of the Islamist actors mentioned in this presentation. So just a brief background on the key aspects of Gramscian theory that I'll be using. So I'll be using the concept of hegemony. So Gramsci basically is an Italian Marxist thinker who began from the point where he was trying to address the question of why Marx's analysis that advanced Western capitalist states would be the first to adopt or to have a successful communist revolution, as opposed to Marx's belief that it would occur in advanced Western capitalist states, and it did in fact occur in what he saw as backward states such as Russia. So Gramsci looks at the advanced Western states where Marx had believed these would be successful and asked why this had occurred. So one quote from Gramsci is that he said, "In the East, the state was everything. The civil society was primordial and gelatinous, and in the West, there was a proper relation between the state and civil society. And when the state trembled, a sturdy structure of civil society was at once revealed. The state was only an outer ditch behind which there stood a powerful system of fortresses and earthworks." So essentially what he's saying is that civil society in the advanced Western states was strong, both in its structure as well as its support for and alignment with the ruling class's ideology and interests. So hegemony for Gramsci is the situation in which the ruling classes have diffused their ideology throughout the society and led them to view the existing arrangements and relationships between classes as normal and natural. And this process of hegemony occurs through cultural institutions such as schools, the media, and religion, particularly in official formulations of religion. Common sense for Gramsci is the result of this. So the ruled classes coming to believe that the way things are is the natural order. And this common sense held by most people is blind to the oppressive nature of the relationships between classes for Gramsci. So in its place, he aims for what he labels as good sense, thinking that comprehends the reality of these arrangements and relationships and is built upon the thinking of and what he labels as organic intellectuals, those who truly represent the interests of their own class. So another key dichotomy I'll be using from Gramsci is his conceptualization of wars of position and maneuver. So building upon these insights, he advocates an alternative strategy for a successful revolution, which is much more long-term. He describes the Bolsheviks and others as having a war of maneuver, which is taking, as the war analogy as he uses, it's taking land, attempting to move forwards. So in place of this, Gramsci advocates for a war of position, which he labels as the only viable possibility in the West. And I would extend this to pretty much all modern states with a developed civil society, including Indonesia. So Gramsci has this is perhaps my favorite quote from Gramsci. He states, nobody wanted to be the manure of history, but is it possible to plow without first manuring the land? So both plowman and manure are necessary. So the above quote, the previous quote emphasizes the importance of preparing the society for cultural change throughout all levels of society so that it can reach a stage at which an alternative civil society is established and the barrier to a war of maneuver is removed. So this involves the role of organic intellectuals who are thinkers reflecting, again, the genuine interests of their class. It involves resistance to domination in culture and takes up specific battlegrounds to build counter-hegemony. The war of hegemony is the concept of hegemony, Gramsci states. So another concept I'll be using from Gramsci is the concept of transformism, which is the co-opting of opposition figures and movements into official or recognized positions and the process of bringing in antagonistic forces in order to pacify them. So once the more extreme ends of the political structure are brought under a government umbrella, they have a tendency to come towards the center ground or closer to the government position. So for the first of the two, the hegemony and the counter-hegemony sections, in this I'll be looking at how Pancasila is diffused not just by force, but by the establishment of an education. So in particular, the way Islamic studies are formulated and which aspects of Islamic teachings are played up and downplayed. So for a very simple example, the concepts around tolerance are played up as it's seen to be in line with the national desire to unite a country that has six or so major religions. Whereas aspects to do with the exclusivity or salvationary exclusivity are downplayed, and also aspects to do with Islamic politics are definitely downplayed. As part of this, we'll be looking at the enfranchisement and disenfranchisement of Islamic groups based on their commitment to Pancasila. Ignore that what I said, make those into separate slides, sorry. And this will be looking at not just outright banning, but just the way that groups are promoted or receive support from the government. For example, the state Islamic universities, the IAIN, and the Council of Islamic Scholars, both of which were established during the Suharto era. So the more significant part of my thesis will be on the counter-hegemonic work, as I believe less has been done on this as there has on the previous section. So I'm just going to present briefly 4 actors or groups that I'll be discussing throughout my thesis. So the first of these, I've tried to come up with a variety of different types of actor or organization to give just some variety of different approaches. So the first one is the Prosperous Justice Party, the Partai Keadilan Sejahtera, which is a parliamentary party which has quite a number of seats. It's becoming increasingly the main opposition party in Indonesia, and it has its root ultimately as a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And next one is Habib Rizik, who is currently jailed. He was the leader of the also now banned Islamic Defenders Front, which is predominantly a vigilante group that operates throughout Indonesia, and which Habib Rizik also has some polemics and other writings. Adian Husseini, who is the head of the Dewan Dakwah Islamiyah Indonesia, is a university lecturer in Bogor, on the outskirts of Jakarta. Then I've looked at Farid Okba, who is a religious scholar who's started or has joined a political party. While it's not particularly influential, I'm looking at it more in terms of another approach that religious scholars or aspects of the Islamist community have utilized. While it might seem that I would obviously look at groups that had outright rejected Pancasila, such as Hizb ut-Tahrir or Jemaah Islamiyah or its various offspring, the reason I've excluded it is I'm trying to look predominantly at groups who are engaging with Pancasila in some way. Also, Hizb ut-Tahrir tends to be very ideologically consistent no matter which country it's in. So I don't feel that anything I'm going to bring in terms of its engagement with Pancasila, being that it's going to be an outright rejection, is going to be particularly something new, new research. So the first group I'll be mentioning is the Prosperous Justice Party. Its origins in Indonesia lie in what was known in the New Order era as Jemaah Tarbiyah, the group for education. It had a strong presence on university campuses and focused on a long-term strategy of Islamizing society from the bottom up through education and ideological inculcation of their values. So the PKS does not call for the implementation of the Sharia or establishment of an Islamic state. This is according to Anies Baswedan, due to those issues having become either unpopular to the Indonesian populace or at least that they are seen as unimportant as a major electoral issue. They have essentially put these items on the back burner to be returned to later once more education has been done in society. They've assumed a role of an opposition that represents the constituency of religious Muslims in Indonesia. For example, in recent months, we've seen a cultural battleground similar to what Gramsci would have identified as a site for part of a war of position in the interrogation of civil servants regarding their religious affiliation and loyalty to the state. So PKS's approach is very relevant to a Gramscian analysis, as the movement, particularly through its original form of Jemaah Tarbiyah, the Indonesian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, aimed to build a counter-hegemonic strategy by establishing deep roots in society and a form of an alternative society. In this section, I'll also be discussing how the group has taken on board a pro-Pancasila position against the government in order to criticise the government's lack of role for religious ideals. The group also works as a parliamentary force opposing policies that sideline religion, which could potentially lessen Indonesian Muslims' ability to practice their religion. In this regard, their approach is very similar to that of Erdogan of Turkey, while officially the two groups are not calling for Islamic laws, they have repeatedly worked at ensuring laws passed are amenable to the concerns of religious Muslims. The second person I'll look at is Habib Rizk, who is former head of the Islamic Defenders Front, which is a vigilante group who've at many times been engaged in attacks on street prostitution, gambling dens, bars, particularly operating during Ramadan. They've collaborated with certain aspects in the police to do these raids. As I briefly mentioned as well, the Islamic Defenders Front has now been banned by Jokowi's government. Habib Rizk has always been very strongly critical of Jokowi and President Jokowi and his party. So a key work that I'll be looking at as part of this is Habib Rizk's master's thesis, which is on the role of Pancasila in the establishment of Sharia in Indonesia. So Rizk has a revisionist view of Pancasila, and that he uses the issue of the oft-cited 7 words of the Jakarta Charter to claim that Pancasila establishes the obligation of implementing the Sharia. So he basically says that the belief in one God is analogous to Tawheed in Islamic belief, the oneness of God, and so that this subsequently necessitates implementing Islamic law, since that's inherently a part of Islam. So in this, Rizk manages to turn the paradigm and claim that he and his followers are the true inheritors of Pancasila, and that despite the claims of his opponents, those opponents are the ones actually engaged in anti-Pancasila activity. So Pancasila's hegemonic position in Indonesian discourse has perhaps influenced more the language through which the demand for an Islamic state is framed, rather than its terms. Rizk is still focused strongly on the implementation of the Sharia, yet he will claim such legitimacy for such a project through Pancasila. And he claims that the Jakarta Charter is the true form of Pancasila, that this has been abused by later Indonesian leaders, particularly people like Sukarno or Megawati Sukarno Putri, or liberal or reformist Muslims such as Abdurrahman Wahid, Nurhalis Majid, Ulil Absar, Lutfi Ash-Shawkani, and other members of the Islam liberal network. For Rizk, Pancasila itself is not the problem. Instead, he views what he would argue as the misuse of Pancasila towards what he labels with the play on words, which he often uses, of the separatist virus. So that's Indonesian for syphilis, secularism, pluralism, and liberalism. Importantly, Rizk does not call for the establishment of a new Islamic state in Indonesia. In his writings, he takes time to differentiate his movement from the Darul Islam rebellion against the Republican government that took place during the Sukarno presidency. At the same time, though, he doesn't criticize those leaders. Rather, he presents the actions of those involved in the rebellion as being in response to the treachery of secularist forces in the government, generally referring to Sukarno and Marxists, in betraying the true Islamic nature of the Jakarta Charter and the 1945 Constitution. He states that Indonesia is already an Islamic state, that it implements the laws of the Sharia, albeit not in their entirety, and that the primary focus of his call is to implement the remainder of the Sharia at a national level. So he gives the example in terms of Islamic law of family law, and certain laws of the endowments are based on Islam. So while Rizk himself is university educated and has recently been awarded his doctorate from Malaysia, his rhetoric is aimed almost entirely at general masses and is calculated to have emotional impact rather than engaging on an academic level. Is at times very harsh and obscene language towards his opponents is indicative of this. So the next person I'll be looking at is Adian Husseini. So Adian Husseini is the current head of the Islamic Propagation Council of Indonesia. Excuse me. The Dewan Dakwah Islam Indonesia. This organization was originally founded by the extremely influential Islamist Muhammad Nasir after the Masyumi party was banned during the Sukarno era. So Masyumi was the primary Islamist opposition party in parliament for the majority of Sukarno's era, and it, at its peak, included both leaders from both modernist leaders from Muhammadiyah and traditionalists from Nahdlatul Ulama. Nahdlatul Ulama did leave towards the end. So after Masyumi was banned, the Islamic Propagation Council was established as a means of spreading education with the ultimate goal of Islamizing society using an educational approach. So Hussein is considered generally to be a hardline preacher. He has, similarly to Rizik, attempted to work within a Pancasila framework to call for an increased Islamization of Indonesian society. His approach differs from Rizik, however, in that his primary focus is academic and his targets come from the educated classes. He lectures at a university in Bogor in West Java, and the targets of his criticism also reflect this, as seen in his works targeting liberal and university-educated Muslims, particularly those associated with the state Islamic universities. So I've just got here a few of his recent works. So this is one of his more famous works. It's Pancasila is not to crush the constitutional rights of the Muslim nation. This is again using the terminology of viruses to describe alternative ideologies. So the virus of liberalism in Islamic tertiary education. And this is religious pluralism is prohibited. It's a commentary on the Majlis Ulama Indonesia's fatwa that they gave prohibiting secularism and religious pluralism. So this next actor is Farid Okbar. So Farid Okbar is a both Indonesian and Middle Eastern educated scholar, who's religious scholar, who's recently become heavily involved in the establishment of two Islamic political parties. The first is the Masyumi Reborn Party. They split over some minor issues with that group and now have formed what they call the Partai Dakwah Rakyat Indonesia, or the Indonesian People's Propagation Party. So the group places strong emphasis on what they call the establishment of an Islamic ideological party using a constitutional path to implement the Islamic law. So the group differs both from PKS as well as Habib Rizik and Adian Husseini. They share with the latter groups an emphasis on the importance of ideology and the implementation of Islamic law. However, they differ in that they utilize a more direct method, aiming to operate in parliament where possible. So they're a very recently established party. I don't think they have massively strong prospects of achieving parliamentary representation, but that's their goal. They're also differ from PKS in that they're far stricter in sticking to their ideological goals. They refuse to make alliances with non-Muslim parties and maintain a commitment to the implementation of Islamic law. The final group I was going to look at in the counter-hegemonic section is what Donald Porter describes as incorporated Muslim groups. So Porter outlines the strategies Indonesian governments have used to suppress Islamist aspirations. The main framework that he utilizes for this analysis is corporatism. So corporatism involves the depoliticization of society. Specifically in the Indonesian context, under the new order, it utilized the floating mass strategy, and where potential political activists and representatives of workers' groups, political religious groups, and others were prevented from access to their grassroots bases. Functional groups were organized into government-authorized organizations, and these would form the sole means of each group's dealing with government. So alongside the reorganization to a highly supervised and controlled political party, the new order also established officially recognized groups for the representation of Muslim or Islamic interests and for defining orthodoxy. Foremost amongst these were the Council of Ulama Indonesia, the Majlis Ulama Indonesia, and the Association of Indonesian Muslim Intellectuals, the ICMI. As Porter has argued, rather than being seen as evidence of an Islamic turn in the latest 100 years, as some have argued, the establishment of these organizations should rather be seen as an evolved form of his and earlier Sukarno's policy of controlling dissent through incorporating independent groups and actors into government-controlled representative bodies. This doesn't mean, however, that we should view these organizations as mere puppets following government instructions, nor should the fact that the New Order regime and its successors have sought to use these institutions as instruments of control lead us to believe that they have at all times been in entirely dominant positions and able to dictate the entirety of their agenda. Rather, a number of groups from among what Porter labels as the incorporated Muslims have utilized a Gramscian war of position strategy. This has taken the form of extracting concessions for increased Muslim ability to practice their religion in the form of the removal of bans on Islamic head coverings for female school students. It's also taken the form of successfully advocating for the obligation of religious education in schools and working to shape the curriculum of religious education and for religious classes to be taught by adherents of the same religion. So this spectrum of groups will allow for an analysis of a variety of different counter-hegemonic strategies by Islamist groups in Indonesia. While they all share very similar goals to bring about an Indonesian society in which Islam plays a much more prominent role, they differ greatly in their approach and locus of action. For PKS, the party, the target of implementation of Islamic law has largely been put aside, and the focus is in two directions. First, in expanding the realm of freedom for Muslims to practice their religion, and then in preventing government restriction on the one hand, and on the other towards educational programs to increase the religiosity and ideological understanding of Indonesian Muslims through their Tarbiyah approach. Academics such as Adian Husseini utilize an academic approach, shaping the next generation of Indonesian Muslim intellectuals and providing an opposition in the academic arena to the more dominant liberal and reformist trends in other Indonesian Islamic universities. Finally, the ideologically political party seeking to implement the Sharia via constitutional means is represented by groups such as Farid Okbar and the Partai Dakwah Rakyat Indonesia. So I'll just finish up by giving a brief few examples of sites of contestation or battleground sites in this war of position that have been used by Islamist groups to attempt to achieve further public support or win some ground in government. So the first of these is Megawati Sukarno Putri, the ex-president of Indonesia and still very influential over the current president, leader of the founder of the PDIP party. Her attacks that she made in 2019, I believe it was, on Islamists and their closed ideology, and then the subsequent attacks on her religiosity from Islamists. The second is earlier this year, a couple of months ago, we had the Anti-Corruption Commission questions in their competency exam, asking civil servants to affirm their loyalty to the state above their religious affiliation, and the response of Islamist parties such as PKS. And the third was another issue from this year where Megawati Sukarno Putri sent a congratulatory message to the Chinese Communist Party on the anniversary of their 100th anniversary, and the blowback from Islamists on this. So on this first site was announced on, it took place on the occasion when President Jokowi was announcing Pancasila Day as a new public holiday. This is the choice of this date by Jokowi's regime is significant, as it is the anniversary of the more secularly oriented formulation, not today's final formulation of Pancasila. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this actually occurred on the 1st of June rather than the date of today's formulation of Pancasila. And Megawati's speech was also very strongly reflective of this. She began by emphasizing the fact that her party is an ideological party established on the Indonesian foundations of the 1st of June 1945 and the ideology of Pancasila. She then criticized those who she labeled as their opponents, holding a closed-minded ideology. In this thinly veiled reference to Islamists, she described them as threatening the unity of Indonesia and of not being representative of the aspirations of the Indonesian people. She stated that they only arise out of concerns of a single group, meaning they represent only one religion. And she stated that the adherents of this closed ideology claim to know everything that happens, even after the point of death, despite nobody having seen this. This last sentence in particular was the center of controversy after the speech, as she appeared to be claiming that the Islamic belief in an afterlife was not certain. Habib Rizik in particular took the lead on this and accused Megawati of disbelief and of offending the Muslim Ummah. So rather than viewing these responses as an expression just of intolerance, we can gain more insight into these contests if we understand them as sites of contestation. Sorry?
Oh, Peter, you're finishing up in a couple of minutes. We're coming up to 40 minutes, so we just need some time.
Okay, I'm just on this second last slide. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes, so we understand them as sites of contestation between hegemony and counter-hegemonic forces. I'll just rush through the last couple. The second site was the Anti-Corruption Commission recently had an exam in which they had 2 questions on for new civil servants entering the Anti-Corruption Commission. The first of which was whether female students would be willing to remove their headscarf for the sake of the country. And the second was whether if they could only choose one or the other, whether they would choose to follow the Quran or to follow Pancasila. So PKS party took the lead in this, criticising sectors within state structure for bringing Pancasila and Islam into conflict with each other. And PKS presented themselves as the upholders of Pancasila and emphasised the importance of Pancasila as a national ideology. The final site, so this is from earlier this year as well, where Megawati released a video congratulating the Chinese Communist Party on their 100th anniversary. Quite similar to the first of these 3, she was again accused of contradicting Islam and Pancasila. Obviously, in Indonesia, communism is, Marxist thought is still banned. There's not really much controversy over that. That's the wrong word to use. Sorry, it's quite widely held by anyone in positions of power. Marxism should not be acceptable in public, in political life. So what is most important in this, the criticisms that were led by, again, leaders such of various Islamists, is not that there was criticism, but the fact that the basis of these critiques was Pancasila. So Islamists used Pancasila and accused Megawati of contravening Pancasila in their attacks on her congratulations towards the Chinese Communist Party. So to summarize, the thesis is focused on the role of hegemony and counter-hegemony, cultural battles or wars of position play in shaping political and religious thought in Indonesia. There's been increasing change in the rhetoric around Pancasila, and these groups now use Pancasila and their own claimed sense of nationalism to contest the ground of Pancasila and move it into a more Islamically oriented direction. These Islamists now claim themselves to be the true inheritors and upholders of Pancasila and have used this to make strong claims about their sense of patriotism and loyalty to the state. These are all examples of what Gramsci discussed as sites for wars of position, and each issue is a potential battleground to push their worldview and build for the future.